Coming up on Theater Talk.
Louis Armstrong was a major key artist. He was fundamentally an optimist. Now, he wasn't naive in any way. He knew the score about the world. But he looked on the bright side.
And also he got stoned every night of his life.
Every day of his life.
Sure did.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Louis Armstrong.
70 years old, and here I am at the Waldorf Astoria. How'd I get so lucky?
From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
Louis Armstrong was one of the greatest musical artists of the 20th century, and he was the first jazz superstar.
He happened to be, by the way, my father's favorite musician.
Well, then there you go.
I grew up with
He was
8-track
Bob
tapes.
Riedel's
8-track tapes in the big Chrysler wagon, listening to Louis Armstrong.
8-track tapes.
Remember Terry? Remember 8-track tapes?
Us, doesn't it?
Well,
Her chunk.
That's right. All you could do was fast forward. That's all you could do.
That's all you could,
a song, but yeah.
not to take anything away from your father's 8-track collection, but Terry Teachout, the eminent critic for the Wall Street Journal and Commentary magazine, has written a play about Louis Armstrong, Satchmo at the Waldorf, which is now playing at the West Side
And
Theater.
it's based on
his
Terry's excellent new book.
No, it's an
Pops.
excellent 2009.
2009 book. Is
It's an
it in
excellent old
paperback?
book.
Yeah. Is it in paperback though? Pops?
Yes, it
Still and available on Kindle, but we get ahead of ourselves. There is an amazing performance by John Douglas Thompson, who is returning to us
Yes, after
for a second time this season.
After a Time to Kill.
After a
After
Time
a
to
Time
Kill.
to
I
Kill.
remember we had a very jolly interview.
You were great in A Time to Kill, but this is you alone on stage, and it is something
You and a trumpet,
everyone
that's
has to see.
And a
And
hanky.
several characters.
That's right.
Yes,
And Miles Davis.
we'll talk. You
Terry,
played.
I wanted to ask you a quick question though. Why did he have two nicknames? Why Satchmo and why Pops?
Well, they were unrelated. He was called, Satchmo is short for satchel mouth. He was dubbed that when he went to England, and Armstrong had a very large mouth, and he got shortened by accent to Satchmo.
By the British accent, yeah.
Yeah, and he loved it.
Satchel mouth.
He loved it. You know, he put it on his stationery. He embraced the name. Pops was what he called people. He called everybody Pops, especially if you can remember your name. And so people started calling him that back. And it's very natural, of course, because he's a great father figure of jazz, and that's how it ended up becoming the title of my book.
What got you on to this extensive research and artistic inspiration, which has led to a book and a play about Louis Armstrong?
Well, it goes all the way back to childhood. It was 1964, I guess, and I was playing in the backyard one Sunday, and my mother said, "I want you to come in." So I came in, and she said, "There's somebody on the television I want you to see because he won't be around forever." And it was Armstrong, I think probably performing Hello, Dolly on the Ed Sullivan Show. And like everybody else who sees him for the first time, I was just blown away. And this was one of the seeds that eventually led to my becoming a jazz musician, which was what I did before I became a writer. If you're interested in jazz, you're interested in Armstrong. And many, many, many years later, I realized there needs to be a new biography of Armstrong. There's an enormous amount of source material. He's somebody I'd like to write about. Biographers are drawn to great personalities, and Louis Armstrong was the greatest of personalities. So I wrote this book.
When did you encounter Armstrong?
You mean as a
As a
kid,
person,
as a kid?
When were you aware of it?
I'll be honest with you. I think I saw him do some Disney song, Zippity Doo Dah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
right.
saw that, and I have to be very, and I told this with Terry and also with Gordon, my first encounter with Armstrong was a very negative one. I didn't quite receive him in the same way that most people
As was the
received
case with many people of
And when you
Well,
say negative,
my
in what way?
generation.
You thought he'd
You know, there was this whole thing about the Uncle Tom thing,
Yeah,
you know, and the big smile and the grin and the sweating and the handkerchief and the mugging.
And to sell out to the white songs, Hello Dolly and all that.
Right, and I didn't really understand that aspect of it. I just looked at him on TV and he didn't seem like a substantial figure, someone that I should be focusing on or paying attention
Well,
to.
this is much about the struggle that you're dealing with.
Right, that we're dealing with. He kind of seemed like an old relic.
Yes.
Promoting more stereotypes than anything else.
And of course that was,
that was my very thin view, thin perspective of him. So the play kind of gave me a perspective.
In Terry Teachout's wonderful book, I found this quote by Ossie Davis. And he said, most of the fellows I grew up with, myself included, we used to laugh at Louis Armstrong. We knew he was good, but that didn't save him from our malice and ridicule. Everywhere we looked, there'd be Louis, sweat popping, eyes bugging, mouth wide open, grinning from ear to ear, mopping his brow, ducking his head, doing his thing for the white man. Was that your response in the beginning?
Well, I didn't quite take it to that extent, but I could understand where he's coming from.
But then he goes on to say that he met Louis Armstrong and developed tremendous respect.
And that criticism that Ossie Davis hurled at Armstrong at that particular time in his life, was there any validity to that? Had he sold out in any way? Was he?
It just depends on your point of view. You have to remember Armstrong was not Ossie Davis's contemporary. He was born in 1901. The world was different. When he was coming up, he was a titanic figure of racial pride, as well as a great culture-changing genius. Nobody remains contemporary forever, and by the 50s, by the 60s, racial attitudes had changed. But Armstrong was still the man that he had always been. He saw no reason to change. He was what he was, and so he was seen in a different way. The validity is a matter of your point of view. I think if you have a problem with the surface, once you get below that surface, you discover the great master, the great artist, and also the great spirit. And part of the idea, both of writing Pops and of writing Satchmo at the Waldorf, is to take you below that surface, to take you backstage, to show you what Armstrong was really like when the red light was off. And we're able to do that because Armstrong wrote thousands of letters. He made lots of private tapes of his offstage conversations, which John has heard. You can know what he was like when the public wasn't looking.
So he was, like any great entertainer, he had created a personality that had always worked, and he was going to stick to it.
Well, I mean, it wasn't entirely a creation. I mean, the Armstrong that you saw on television was the real Louis Armstrong.
I think a lot of people tend to look at Armstrong from the perspective of Hello Dolly.
Yeah.
And the guy on stage with the handkerchief and sweating and singing Hello Dolly. He's so much more than that. And so the play gives a much more broader context. So what I learned was, not only his greatness, his ebullience, his obvious commitment to civil rights, the way he felt about art and politics and other things, but I also learned what was his general motor, what drove him to be as good as he is, or good as he was, and how he made such an incredible impact on not only Americans, but all over the world. Yeah. And so once you look at his whole life in context, you see the icon, you see the genius. Where I was looking at, my generation typically followed people like Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Wayne Shorter, these boppers, right? And they were very aggressive musicians, and very aggressive about civil rights and all that sort of stuff.
And also, they had contempt for him, but Miles Davis made a big point of saying, I studied music, and I went to college.
Well, that's the Dizzy Gillespie thing.
Exactly, and you have, as you make so clear, Louis Armstrong, who came from nothing, learned to play the cornet and developed it in the the welfare home, and then worked all his life and was just this natural genius.
But also a serious and self-aware artist.
Yes.
That's one of the things that, this play is not a history lecture. It is a play about the relationship between Armstrong and Joe Glazer, his white Jewish manager. But in the course of describing this relationship and portraying it, you find out a lot about what Armstrong was really like, what his career was like, how he really felt about things. And that's important too. The play contains the context, but it's not a lecture. It's a real play.
No, and the other thing that you make in his relationship with Joe Glazer, who he allowed to control his money for better or for worse, and people looked at him and said, how can you let this white man control your destiny? But as you make so clear, in the context of this time, Louis Armstrong was traveling around. They wouldn't let him stay in hotels. They wouldn't let him eat in the restaurant. He was completely beholden.
Just got to remember who he was and where he came from. Born in 1901 in Storyville, New Orleans, in the gutter, a black man, and nothing was open to him. He opened the world for himself, but he needed and knew that he needed the help of a strong, well-connected, and as we discover in the play, a mob-connected white manager to get him through those doors.
What, mob involved in clubs?
Jazz music,
I never knew.
Who knew,
I
right?
never
Who knew?
Give us a sense. You mentioned that he recorded a lot of his conversations. What did he talk about? What was he like in those
talked
conversations?
about everything.
Tell them about the one with Lucille.
This is my favorite tape. Armstrong, he was one of the very first civilians, so to speak, to own a tape recorder. He bought his first one in 1947. He bought it to tape his shows so that he could listen to them and perfect them. He's, again, a serious artist. But it was a wonderful toy. And also, remember that this is a man who knew what he was. He knew how important he was. So he started taping conversations just randomly, and eventually, he would turn the tape recorder on at a dinner party or in his dressing room. There's a tape of him getting high backstage at a club with Stephen Fetchit. But the tape John is talking about.
He was the Richard Nixon of the jazz clubs.
Yes. Well, he didn't make any secret of it. Everybody knew it. But this tape,
knew they were being.
Yeah, they knew what was going on. But sometime in the 50s, he's somewhere on the road in a hotel room with his wife, Lucille. And he's turned on the tape recorder, and she doesn't realize it. And he is attempting to get her into the sack. It's about 2 or 3 in the morning. And she's really not interested. She's not up for that at this time of night. And he says, well, you've got to do it because it's your duty to keep that horn percolating. Lucille's not going to have any of that. And then she looks around and she sees that the tape recorder is on. And she says, you turn that off, Louis. In fact, you erase that. And he says, I can't do that. It's for posterity. And I'll never forget, these tapes are all on deposit at the Armstrong Archives at Queens College. I was working on the book. I was listening to this tape, in the very formal setting of a library and archive, and I've got my headphones on, and he says this. And suddenly it hits me. That's me. I'm posterity. Here I am, listening to this tape.
And he was also a writer himself.
And a good one.
And wrote the first autobiography.
Yeah, he wrote the first autobiography by a jazz musician. His second one was written without any assistance, no ghostwriter.
Right.
He wrote these thousands of letters.
Is he honest in the autobiography? I mean,
Yes.
you've looked at his life. Is he candid, or is he?
There are things that he leaves out, but he never distorts. He understands, I believe, that he is a major figure in history, and he feels that he does have a debt to posterity.
There's obviously some curse words on the tapes. And
as there are in the play.
As there are in the play. And you just get a different perspective of Armstrong, a much more human perspective.
And which you give us, but also the thing is that Louis Armstrong made a big point of always presenting this positive front, even when he was singing Black and Blue.
What did I do to be so black and blue?
He said, I don't want to make it so that people are depressed by it.
Right. They would sing and perform in a way that would still make
be
people
upbeat
feel
about,
happy about even a song that they're hearing.
Even a
which
song
could
like
be a
that
downer.
of
Showbiz.
racial oppression.
Showbiz.
He was fundamentally an optimist. Now, he wasn't naive
Right.
in any way. He knew the score about the world.
Right.
But he looked on the bright side.
Yeah.
And his music contains this.
And also he got stoned every night of his
Every
life.
day of his
after the
life.
show.
Sure did.
Do you play?
Good
that
man.
was-
Good man.
You bring that little bit of a stoned. Your
I'm a
performance.
method actor.
I want to ask you guys. We know what Coltrane and Davis thought about him and the condescending
Primarily, yeah.
attitude they
Primarily
had.
Davis,
What did he think about them? What did he think about their music and what they were doing?
Certainly from the play, the perspective of the play, he felt, that bop, Terry can speak more to the specifics, but that bop music was a little bit too fast, moving in a direction that wasn't quite listener friendly.
Right, got out too far in front of the audience, I think I
And
made
I
him say
even
in
make
the
that
play,
I even
yeah.
make that mention in the play that the beboppers got too far out in front of the people, and his idea was to please the audience, to give them what they wanted.
Right.
And figuring that bebop was not what certainly his audience wanted.
At the same time, though, he listened to this music. He really admired Gillespie as a trumpet player, said so many times. His record collection survives, and we know what its contents were. He even listened to Thelonious Monk. So he had a right to these opinions. They weren't just reflexes.
And didn't he also feel, now this is when he was an older artist, some dismay that he was playing at the Waldorf, for instance, to a totally white audience, whereas these other younger men were playing to black audiences, and he just wasn't getting them because he wasn't being perceived in the same way.
Yeah, he began to lose his black audience. Well, many jazz musicians did.
Yeah,
You know, it was kind of more pointed with Armstrong because he was such a strong representation of black pride when he began to play, and he had a huge black audience that followed him all over. And then towards the end of his career, certainly, if not towards the end, but even maybe even more towards the middle, going to the end, he started to lose that black audience. And you get a lot of younger blacks who are into jazz following people like Miles Davis and Coltrane and all these bombers.
And he was the Hello Dolly man.
Hello, Dolly. This is Louis Dolly.
This is the guy who did Hello Dolly, started jazz music, influenced pop music, but we give you a much more broader understanding.
But we also give the devil his due, so to speak, because the third character in the play is Miles Davis.
Yes,
Yeah.
and which you also do, yes.
I play, yeah.
The setting of the play is Armstrong's dressing room at the Waldorf. It's his last gig a few months before his death. He's just come off stage after the last set. He's talking to you about what his life has been like, and then suddenly Joe Glazer appears, and he is also talking about his relationship with Armstrong. The play appears at first to be a dialogue between the two men, but then Miles Davis shows up and expresses this point of view that is familiar to John's generation, that Armstrong wasn't Uncle Tom, that he was out of touch. So you really have this, I think, very complex dialogue of these 3 points of view on Armstrong.
Right. And the thing that's really interesting with Glazer and Armstrong is they're both commenting on the same experience, but they have different perspectives of it, how it actually turned out. Right. And Armstrong, certainly with Miles Davis, and he was a character that we added later on in the process of working on the play, to really be the strong detractor and represent that voice that was really pointing at Armstrong and saying, no, this guy's a bad example, don't follow him.
I wanted to give them all their due, all the points of view their due. That the deck is not stacked. I mean, in my biography, obviously, I tell you what my point of view is. But in this play, the characters are speaking in a sense for themselves. And you must make up your own mind who you side with. Or maybe you decide that you side with all of them or none of them.
Each perspective perhaps may be valid at that particular time.
Yeah, it's kind of
because his choice of material then was interesting. I think of that song, that the James Bond song from On Her Majesty's.
We have all the time in the
I
world.
I have to say,
one of his very last records.
I got to say, I love
like
that
it.
song. I like
do.
it.
I
But
like
I mean,
it.
if you're Miles Davis, you got to think, why is the guy picking this goop?
Why did he do that? You say-
Why is he
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
this goop?
And of course,
Because
if you're
he-
Louis Armstrong, you know that you don't have all the time in the world.
That's right.
You're an old, sick man. And that adds
That's
a
what gave that
whole different
song
layer of meaning
its-
to it.
You have the incredible work he did in the 1920s, in the late 20s and 30s, these innovative,
Hot Fives and Hot
amazing jazz
Sevens,
records.
yeah.
And the one thing that Glazer, the white manager who came and put him on the road and made him a superstar, he said, you have to enunciate better and clean up your tunes for the white man, because you have early Louis Armstrong who was scat singing and you couldn't understand the words, but it's so dynamic. He's like a great rock singer, just with such energy and drive.
And yet at the same time, as Armstrong says in the play, and this is what he felt in real life, he also loved singing ballads.
Yeah.
And he loved the idea of broadening his audience and singing quite sophisticated songs like Body and Soul. He was the first person to make a jazz recording of Body and Soul, for example, when these songs were new. So it's never as simple as it looks.
So, yeah.
John, you are so talented, but you do not play the trumpet, am I correct?
No, I do not.
But you
You
managed.
wouldn't guess
not.
it
wouldn't
to
guess
look at it.
That's right.
That was one of my, when Terry brought the play to me, I said, listen, I can't sing. and I can't play the
He
trumpet.
says he can't
But you do sing, you
But I do
he's gonna
sing a
fool
little
you.
bit. You know, I do
He's
sing
gonna
a
So you
little
learn
bit.
figuring.
Well, no, I went to some people at Tanglewood, because I was up at Shakespeare at the time, and I said, can you guys teach me just a little bit of Armstrong on the trumpet, you know, from what you can teach me? And they said, we can't.
Nope.
We can't play his notes. I mean, some of them haven't even been codified.
Wow.
We can't do anything with that for you.
And I never wanted an actor to pretend to be playing the trumpet. That never looks right.
Right. Yeah.
But John, you know, he cleans the trumpet, he disassembles it, puts it back together again,
He
he
came up
holds
with
it like a
ways
trumpet
to make
player.
it look like, you know.
I think you might well come away from the show thinking that you'd heard John play the trumpet.
Do we know what kind of trumpet he
Played a Selmer.
A Selmer. And the trumpets are available. Like, can you see the trumpets at the?
At the Armstrong Archive, you can see lots of Armstrong trumpets, mouthpieces, even one of the handkerchiefs that he used on
Yeah,
stage.
yeah.
We got to end with "Hello, Dolly."
Oh, well,
his
let
biggest
him tell
number,
it.
his #1 record. John's a kid singing. What the heck is this guy doing? Singing the song from this
yeah.
Broadway musical. It's so popular it knocks the Beatles
Off the top of the charts.
Off the top of the
Most
charts.
people know Armstrong because of Hello Dolly. You
Dolly.
were just talking about the Hot Fives and the Hot Sevens. Even
Early
people
stuff.
who know of Armstrong do not know that music.
So he does "Hello, Dolly," his biggest hit of all time, but he hates the song, right? What is
Didn't like the song. Didn't like the song. Glaser was approached. Armstrong was between recording contracts, and the song plugger said, "I've got a song from a show that's going to be opening in a few months, and it's Hello, Dolly." And Glaser said, "You know, Louis, record this." And Armstrong listened to it, and well, I can't say on this show what he
What did he
says in
say
the play.
about it?
But he didn't like the song. He didn't think it was very interesting. But he trusted Glaser. He trusted his commercial instinct. So he makes the record, and then he goes out on the road. Take it, John,
Yeah,
because
he
it's
makes
quite
the
a
record.
tale.
He goes out on the road. He's playing in a concert, and all of a sudden, people in the concert are asking him to play "Hello, Dolly." And Armstrong, you know, I'm telling it as it is in the play.
And it's true. It's true.
It is
Minus the four-letter words.
Armstrong looks over at the piano player and says, you know, what is the audience talking about? What the hell are they talking about? And the piano player says, they want you to play that song that you cut in New York a couple of months ago. Armstrong didn't know what it was, couldn't remember it, couldn't remember the words to it, couldn't remember the title of it. So, as it turns out, he calls Glaser. Glaser ships him out a record
On the
of
next
Hello, Dolly
plane.
on the next plane, the next day. They sit in the room and they kind of study the song, remember it. And even though at that point, while he's listening to the song with the rest of the band, he says to the band, the song still sucks. But we have to give the audience
What they want.
What they want. You know, he was really into that. So then, and that's when I get up and I sing Hello, Dolly.
That's our 11 o'clock number.
That's right. No galloping waiters,
And
though, right?
he
No.
sounds just like Pops.
But that, you know,
Take it from me, he does.
the interesting thing I find, at least for me as an actor working on the play and doing the play, is going in and out of these characters, right? To create this very complex story, given these three characters, the two main ones being obviously Armstrong and Glaser and their perspectives on the same event.
Yeah.
And that was important to me. My day job, obviously, is I'm a drama critic. And I often have occasion to review one-person shows about famous historical figures. And they tend to be, somebody comes out on stage, and in the play, yeah, they're old. And they spend 90 minutes telling you how great and wonderful they are.
When
That I did this, that I
1901,
did that.
the day I was
my
born.
triumph here, and-
Plays like that. Gordon Edelstein, the director of Satchmo, he calls them taxidermy plays. And I knew from the beginning that I didn't want to write that kind of play since I don't like it. Why would I want to write it? I wanted to write a play that is driven not by the desire to celebrate, but by dramatic conflict.
Yeah.
And that was where the idea came, to have the actor play Armstrong and Glaser, which means he has to cross a racial line to do it, and to do it on a dime, just like that. And then
Those are
John
the
came
switches.
along, and he can do it. It's like magic. What
I
he does
never
is
thought,
like,
I never really thought looking at it, I said, and I remember sometimes in rehearsals, because there's a lot of lines, it's a one-person play, it's you keeping the energy, keeping the pace, there's no second actor coming in, my second actor is the audience for all intents
you are
and
he.
purposes, right? But I remember just sometimes in rehearsals, like not knowing which character I was when. And you know, a funny thing happened last night, which was really a confluence of like the perfect storm, where I was trying to go through a section of the play to remember where I had injured myself the night before I had hurt myself. So I was like really keeping an eye open for this. And I get to a line and I'm like, that's the place where I hurt myself last night. Don't do this again. And I say a line and there's a laugh that I'd never gotten before from a woman in the audience with a very particular laugh. And I lost track of the whole show. I didn't know if I was Armstrong or Glazer or Davis. I had left the room as Armstrong, Glazer, and
Actually,
Davis.
you started circling
I
the
started
stage.
circling the stage, talking, and I just said, you know what? To the audience, looked them right in the face. I said, you know what? I'm going to have to start over again because I lost my place and I lost my line. So
And
please.
they loved
Oh,
it.
I bet.
And
But
it
you
was
know,
so
exploded
wonderful.
in
I
applause
totally
because
thought
he
that
leveled
would
with
be
it.
But John, if
the
it-
death of my
If-
career.
John, if it ever happens again, when in doubt,
Yes.
just take a pause and go,
Breathe.
hello,
Oh, Dolly.
Dolly. Well, hello.
And the audience will
And
love
they
that,
will
right?
love it.
They'll love it. 8 bars of Hello, Dolly.
Okay, the play is called Satchmo at the Waldorf, a terrific new play about Louis Armstrong, starring the wonderful John Douglas Thompson, written by our friend Terry Teachout of the Wall Street Journal, and also Pops, which is you can still get, right?
You sure can.
Still available. Great. Thanks
At
a lot
any
for being our
bookstore.
guest tonight.
The
John.
West Side Theater upstairs.
West Side Theater upstairs,
Building
that's right.
Come see us.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Corey and Bob Dinelli Charitable Fund, the Noel Coward Foundation, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, plus public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency, and the Theater Development Fund's Technical Accessibility Program, which helps provide closed captioning.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.